Hello and most welcome to 1023 of the series. And today we are going to talk about presence. I got a little interested in the author of the previous, or the editor of the Heidegger commemoration, reading Heidegger. His name is John Sallis. Well, to be perfectly honest, I just went into my book website script and searched for Derrida and Heidegger, and for some reason he came up. John Sallis, that's the name. And the following article is from the Journal of Philosophy, page 594, and it's from October 1984. The name is Heidegger/Derrida, Presence. Two authors are named. Neither will be presence, though one could be, at the event for which the title Heidegger-Derrida serves as an announcement. The event for which this text, which I, a third author, have signed in advance, is to provide a certain preparation. The concern, of course, will be not with those two authors themselves, but with the texts that bear their signatures, with what is usually called, quite carelessly, no doubt, their texts. And so, in the title, the names represent, i.e. substitute for and hence announce certain texts. Or alternatively, they represent either directly or through the signed text a certain theoretical nature, Sache, what is usually called quite carelessly, no doubt, the meaning of the text. Recall the opening sentence of Heidegger's Nietzsche. Nietzsche, the name of the thinker, stands as the title for the matter, die Sache, of his thinking. The substantial representation function thus traces the relation of the author to text, and perhaps less obtrusively the relation to what is meant by the author in the text, author/text/meaning. Let me focus for now on the first of these relations, on the way in which the understanding of it has been prepared. Most decisively, though not exclusively, beginning with Aristotle's On Interpretation. What is written, graphomena, is taken to refer to and to be symbol of symbola. What is spoken, ta phony, and speech is to be understood by reference to the subject who speaks, as an activity of the speaking subject. An author would perhaps reduce this scheme by repressing or merely enacting speech silently, but the relation would remain fundamentally the same. The author producing the text through his activity, expressing in it what is already intact within himself, ta enti psyche pathimata, originating it so as to be entitled to authority over it. Such is the merest sketch, the ordinary, i.e. traditional conception, which the text of Heidegger and Derrida serve to bring thoroughly into question, both in what they say and often also in the very form of saying, both in word and in deed. Most directly, these texts disrupt the traditional conception by showing how it is inseparable from that metaphysics of subjectivity whose transgression this text would broach. Thus, in the Heideggerian text, language proves irreducible to the activity of the speaker, requiring rather, to put it in the very briefest formula, a listening to something said in advance of its sounding in human speech. To this extent, language is withdrawn from the subject. The author dispossessed of what he would otherwise have taken simply as his text. Much the same displacement is released, though from a quite different direction, by certain Derridian texts. For example, by the critique that speech and phenomena brings to bear upon the Husserlian propensity to conceive expression, meaning, signification, in reference to the telos of intuitive fulfillment, and thereby to compromise that very originality or ideality of meaning which the logical investigations was set upon establishing. The conclusion is that signification is essentially capable of functioning independently of all intuition, whether it be that of the sensible present object or the self-present subject. The operation of signification, the functioning of language, does not require the presence, even the mediated presence, of the subject. The text is unaffected by the death of the author. In this sense, though only and precisely in this sense, nothing is to be gained by the presence of the author, even if he were to read his text out aloud, feigning even an originary dictation. What is put at issue immediately by the title is not, however, this chain of substitutions linking author to text and to meaning, but rather to the opposition between the two chains designated by the names of the two authors. Let me focus then on the slash. It functions as a kind of punctuation mark, as one of those non-phonetic elements which appear to distinguish writing, to mark it off from speech. If I were to pronounce the title Heidegger Derrida aloud, for example, at the event for which the text is to provide a certain preparation, if I were to use this text as a pretext for speech, for purposes of that feigning of speech which occurs in reading, then it would be necessary to insert the mark in speech by some kind of artifice, for example, by a gesture that would trace it, or by a substitution of a word such as slash, which would then be functioning in a way quite different from its straightforward semantic function. In living speech, present to all its self-present author, this mark, this trace of writing, cannot be simply presented. It remains outside that speech, thus requiring therein its representative, its substitutive gesture or word. And so the very way in which this mark functions mirrors what will be proved to be at issue between those two authorial chains, between which the mark is drawn. The issue is presence, or more precisely, withdrawal from presence. Ordinarily, this mark, which I have already begun calling by substitution as slash, translating this artifice back into written text, ordinarily is taken as a marking some kind of opposition. And yet, A primary strategy of the Heideggerian and Derridian text is precisely to deconstruct binary opposition. Thus, Heidegger's Nietzsche proposes, in view of such founding opposition as intelligible, sensible, an inversion of Platonism, in which philosophical thinking would also twist free of it, what the Derridian text will designate as the two operations of reversal and displacement. It is a matter of opposite that can be neither reduced to unity nor stabilized hierarchically, nor dialectically sublated into a third term. Under the title Dissemination, it is a matter especially of displacing the free of ontotheology, of destroying the Trinitarian horizon, of adding a fourth, self-effacing term which, like difference, displaces synthesis, opening the triangle on the fourth side, reinscribing it as an open square. And so it is here a matter of preparing such an opening from the opposition of the two authorial chains. In this way, preparing for that event to which this text, which I, a third author, have signed in advance, is directed. Or rather, it is a matter of relinquishing this point, this apex, and of beginning to write a fourth text, feigning a preface. It goes without saying that here it can be a matter only of a beginning, or merely locating the site for a deconstructive geometry. Everything starts with a dyad, and so in order to begin it is necessary to return to the opposition Heidegger and Derrida, and yet remaining for now within the classical conceptuality, e.g. of German idealism. Opposition is never simply such, never opposition as such. Even if absolute in form, opposition is never absolute in content, but presupposes a conditioning position. The opposition of opposite presupposes a common position, the slash conjoining before it can separate. It is from that position that one must begin. Let us begin then from the positing of metaphysic as at its end, its limit, the delimitation of metaphysics in its closure, a positing of it for deconstruction, destruction, or reproducing orthographically the necessary bond of the operation with metaphysics, the deconstruction of metaphysics. This positing is governed by a certain exposure of metaphysics, an exposure of positing common to metaphysics throughout its history, and of warranting to this degree the phrase metaphysics as such. What is common to metaphysics is the positing of being, Sein as presence, itself positing as metaphysics of presence. Hence, it is imperative to understand what presence means, to understand how the meaning of presence is such that metaphysics of presence is posed for delimitation. Deconstruction. It is with the question of the meaning of the presence that one can begin to construct a deconstructive square. So going from the triad to the square, adding the unnecessary difference, will construct the deconstructive square. That's why presence is important. In being and time, presence means predominantly, though not exclusively, Vorhandenheit. In the usual translation, this is to be understood in its correlation with pure seeing, with noenon, with intuition, Anschauung. When something gives itself to one's sheer gaze, when it is simply there for one's looking, displacing itself before and for apprehension, then it has the character of being present at hand. Such a character is to be contrasted with that of things with which one deals concernfully when one manipulates things and puts them to use. The contrast between Vorhandenheit and Zuhandenheit, readiness to hand in the usual translation, is well known, and the relevant analysis offered by Being and Time need not be repeated or even summarized here. What does, however, need to be stressed is the rigorous order that the phenomenological analysis of Being and Time establishes with respect to these two modes. Presence as hand is founded on the readiness to hand. Things to come show themselves as present at hand only when a certain structure of readiness to hand get covered over or repressed. One could say then that in the strict sense everything is ready to hand, or alternatively that there is nothing purely present at hand in what one might take as present at hand, e.g. the hammer merely stared at. There is also something else operative yet repressed, a concealed operation of readiness to hand, a disregarded instrumentality. What is decisive is the displacement of presence that this analysis produces. There are no simply sharely present things, for everything is open or concealedly ready to hand. And what is ready to hand, the hammer, when one takes hold of it and uses it, is not sharely present as a self-contained positivity. Rather, it is extended beyond itself into the referential totality by which it's determined, its presence limited and yet rendered possible by insertion into that totality. But the totality is one of signifying tendencies, references. It is Bedeutsamkeit, the operation of signification. There is no pure presence, for in whatever presents itself there is always in play the operation of signification. Presence is delimited, limited and yet rendered possible by the operation of signification. The Derridian text too is addressed to a delimitation of presence, of that sheer perceptual presence that would be correlative to the stratum of the pre-expressive experience which Husserlian phenomenology would rigorously separate from the operation of signification. It is on the most elementary level that speech and phenomena is focused, simply sensory presence, e.g. of a tone in the living present. That is, it is a matter of deconstruction, the phenomenology of internal time consciousness, bringing fully into play the Husserlian analysis of retention and protension in precisely such a way as to show that phenomenological text works against itself, withdrawing that very self-identical present, the living present, which on the other hand it would preserve as the non-displaceable center, the living core of time, that's presence. Both the Husserlian and the Derridian analysis are well known and need not to be repeated here. Well, they might be. It is in a sense only a matter of stressing that the connection of the present to the immediate past and future is an essential, i.e., constitutive connection. It is not as though there is a present, now, which then comes to be connected to past and future. Rather, these connections belong to its very constitution as a present now, which is to say that there can be no simple self-identical present. The peculiar complexity of the now is elaborated in Speech and Phenomena by means of the concept of repetition. The point is that the now essentially involves a possibility, structure, or movement of repetition in two senses. First, the present now includes repetition of a previous now, namely in retention. In other words, the present now must be constituted in such a way that it is possible for the past now to be repeated in it. Its constitution must be such as to include such a possibility of repetition. Secondly, the present now, the form of presence, is itself ideal and hence infinitely repeatable, its return ad infinitum being inscribed in presence itself. Thus the present now essentially involves the possibility, structure and movement of repetition, both of previous nows in itself and of itself as the ideal form of presence. This figure of repetition may be called the trace. It is, as it were, the figure into which the phenomenological figure is closed off, presence gets deconstructed. Quote, such a trace is, if we can employ this language without immediately contradicting it or crossing it out as we proceed, more primordial than what is phenomenologically primordial. Or again, another quote, in all these directions, the presence of the present is thought of as arising from the bending back of a return, from the movement of repetition, and not the reverse. Something to figure. This operation of the trace, this bending back of a return, by which the presence of the presence is constituted, to employ still under erasure the language of phenomenology. This is also called difference. Or it might be called the operation of signification, taking the latter in the most deconstructively, not phenomenologically primordial way. As in the Heideggerian text, presence is delimited, limited and yet rendered possible by the operation of signification. The latter is not a matter of presence, not even necessarily of presence to, or of an origin, a speaker like writing. Its function is independent of the absence, even the death of the author. Or rather, this operation of signification is writing in that form in which it emerges from the application of the double operation of reversal and displacement to the metaphysical opposition speech/writing. It is as archi-écriture. It is at work at the origin of sense, delimiting presence. In conclusion, 3 issues. 1. Though in being and time, Sein und Zeit, presence means predominantly Vorhandenheit. This is not the only meaning of presence in play. In fact, an entire chain of meanings is introduced at the outset, only to be provisionally abandoned in the published portion of the text. But beginning with the 1927 lecture course, The Basic Problems of Phenomenology, and still more openly in the later texts, a system of meanings of presence is developed along various not easily reconcilable directions. A note in the Derridian text, which is itself characterized as a note on a note from being and time, calls attention to this issue, this problem of translation. It's a quote here. The following pages may be read as a timid prolegomena to a problem of translation. But who better than Heidegger has taught us to think what is involved in such a problem? Here, the question would be the following: how to transfer into, or rather what transpires when we transfer into a single Latin word, presence, the entire differentiated system of Greek and German words, the entire system of translation in which Heideggerian language has. Ousia, Parousia, Gegenwärtigkeit, Anwesen, Anwesenheit, Vorhandenheit, etc. is produced. Above all, how to transfer into the single word presence, both to rich and to poor, the history of Heideggerian text, which associate or disjoins these concepts in subtle and regular fashion throughout an itinerary that covers more than 40 years. 2. On the other hand, the question is whether the Heideggerian text, moving in the system of translations of presence, succeeds in delimiting presence as such. Quote, the Heideggerian delimitation consists sometimes in appealing to a less narrow determination of presence from a more narrow determination of it, thereby going back from the present toward a more original thought of being as presence, Anwesenheit, and sometimes in questioning this original determination itself, giving us to think it as a closure, as the Greco-Western philosophical closure. In the first case, the displacements would remain within the metaphysics of presence in general. End quote. Does this first case really occupy almost the entirety of Heidegger's text? End of quote. Or in the contrary, is there perhaps always in play in the Heideggerian text that directedness announced in the 1927 lecture course? The directedness epikena tis unsias, beyond to an order that is not a matter of being or presence, beyond to the meaning, the truth, the clearing of being, beyond to that which delimits being as presence. 3. Finally, it is necessary to disrupt a web of assumption that I have left undisturbed hitherto. Most pointedly, the assumption that in asking about the meaning of presence, one is asking simply for one or several positive senses. It is necessary to disrupt this assumption of straightforwardness, because meaning has never been conceivable within the history of metaphysics, otherwise than on the basis of presence as a presence. As to take the exceptionally revealing Husserlian case, presence to eidetic intuition. To ask straightforwardly about the meaning of presence is already to assume what presence means, to assume it in a very question of meaning. But then is not the Heideggerian question itself caught in this web of assumptions, and as a result held firmly within the closure of metaphysics? If the question of being, big being, is determined as a question of meaning, as the question of meaning of being, then is it not in its very formulation a question of presence? A question directed toward a recovery of presence. Indeed, this would be so, were it not the case that the Heideggerian text, from being and time on, engages ceaselessly in deconstructive reduction. A delimitation of meaning, its reduction to the Vorhaufin des Entwurfs, its referral to the world, signification, and eventually to aletheia. Meaning as presence becomes, it is reduced to the meaning of presence, the latter taken not straightforwardly but as that which delimits presence. The Heideggerian text, thus releasing the torsion in the question of meaning of presence, twists it free of metaphysical closure. It is not in this way, though, through such distortion that the Heideggerian text could be twisted together with the Derridian text. The authorial chains intertwined in a new contortion, which broach into the domination of what one could like to call presence as such, would form the site of the opposition Heidegger/Derrida? I will leave the next chapter or the next verse to next lecture. Incredibly interesting though. John Sallis is a name to be remembered. And I say good afternoon and thank you very much for listening. Bye bye for now.